Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. Today we're going to talk about magical electional opportunities that are going to be available to us between the Sagittarius Solar Eclipse on December 13th until the Cancer full moon on December 29th. So there's not really a whole lot going on during this time period, which was kind of what I was afraid was going to end up happening, that we just would kind of run out of different options as certain planets moved into certain configurations with one another and things happened. And we're kind of seeing some of that starting to happen now. So there's not a whole lot to talk about, but the things that we have to talk about are kind of important things. So that's going to be interesting. And it was kind of a weird one. Like the whole kind of video is going to be weird for a couple of reasons, partly because like I said, there's not a whole lot going on, but what is going on is kind of important and worth talking about or digging into a little bit. So this video is going to be a little bit different from the other videos in this series, partly because, like I said, there's not a whole lot going on, but what is going on is kind of important and worth digging into a little bit. So because of that, I didn't want to use, one of my more exploratory topics that I hold on to for when there's a time where there are no electional opportunities, which may be something that happens in the near future as some of these planetary configurations continue to tighten. But also, you probably noticed that I'm not on camera, which is different for those who have watched this video or this series for a while. And the reason why I'm not on camera is because I've not had a haircut since January or maybe even December of last year, and I've kind of done my best to keep up with it as much as I can myself, not wanting to be that close to somebody who is that close to people all day, but it finally got kind of too long on the top for me to deal with, and I just kind of buzzed it all off, and so the result is not cute. So we're just going to do this for now, and hopefully next time we'll be back. But let's go ahead and dive into our kind of one and really only electional opportunity for this 2-week period, and it is one that all the locations, Australia, North America, and Western Europe, will share sort of all of these events. So we're going to kind of talk about them in chunks, I guess, or kind of handle them one at a time, and talk about how the different locations, what the differences are, and any sort of special considerations based on the location. So let's go and get started with our chart here, which is set for December 22nd at 12:45 p.m. And this is a North American version of a first Lunar Mansion Talisman. So the first Lunar Mansion is a mansion that is used a lot for motivation, for energy, for drive, and for directing that energy into, hopefully something productive, something useful, something like that. That's how we typically use the first Lunar Mansion talismans, especially during the waxing phase. The waning phases are a little bit different, but this is kind of going to be the setup for North American chart. All the charts are going to be set up this way, I believe, where we have 9 degrees Aries rising, which and the moon in 10 degrees Aries in the first Lunar Mansion, very angular on the ascendant here. And in the North American version, she's applying this conjunction with Mars, who is, also very angular. The ruler of the first house is in its own sign of domicile. So everything here checks out pretty well for a North American version of a first Lunar Mansion talisman. So definitely look into that if you are interested in any of those things at all, especially as we kind of get towards the winter months, where depression and seasonal affective disorder kind of kick in for a lot of people. The first Lunar Mansion can be a really great kind of barrier or buffer between some of those feelings of lack of energy, of demotivation. The first Lunar Mansion can really help you out with if that's something that you're looking for. But at the same time, make sure that you're giving yourself appropriate time to rest. Don't keep pushing yourself, and don't think that you need an astrological talisman to keep you productive when maybe you just need a break. So also be mindful of that as well. The Western European version of this chart is actually very similar. Here set also for December 22nd, but closer to 1 p.m. around 12:57 is what I have this chart here set for. And here it's a little bit different. We've changed things up a little bit in that we still have the moon in the first Lunar Mansion conjoin the ascendant, but instead of the application to Mars like she had in the North American version we just looked at, instead she's going to do the trine to Venus, which is also fine. Venus is a benefic planet, and can definitely give you, can bring you kind of that stabilization, and the energy that you may be looking for is kind of a softer, less explosive type of forward motion, we'll say. But whether that'll actually pan out with it being a Sagittarius, I guess, that may be somewhat of a lateral move, we'll say, from Mars and Aries to Venus and Sagittarius. But all in all, the chart setup is more or less the same. The ruler of the first house is still Mars in Aries in the first house. And now we just have the moon applying to the trine of Venus instead of that conjunction with Mars here. Finally, our Australian version of our first Lunar Mansion talisman is very similar to the Western European version, except for now the moon is backed up a little bit closer to the beginning of Aries in the first degree of Aries. Here we have the moon, in that first Lunar Mansion, conjoin the ascendant like we have for the other two examples. And is applying the trine to Venus like it was in the Western European version. So like I was saying, in the Western European version, the Venus application is probably going to be a little bit of a softer kind of push forward than the conjunction with Mars like in the North American version. So this one might be more of a gentler push, which may be what you need or what you're looking for, than the more forceful impact, we'll call it, of the Mars and Aries conjunction, but still should get the job done, should help you move forward, especially with Venus being in a fire sign. So that first Lunar Mansion talisman is really kind of the only, talismanic opportunity that we have during this 2-week period to really pick up on. So if you need it, go ahead and take advantage of it. If you don't, then I guess we're waiting until the next lunation to see if we have anything a little bit more, more generally useful or, different options rather than just kind of one. But we do have kind of two important astronomical events happening during this 2-week period that are worth talking about. One of them more specifically within the context of astrological magic and how to work with that. And another one sort of just more general, more mundane in its application, but still something worth discussing because everybody's talking about it. So the first event we're going to talk about is the Mercury Kasimi that happens on December 19th or December 20th, depending on your relationship with the international date zone. So being cazimi, a planet that is said to be cazimi, is a planet that is experiencing a particular point in relationship to its cycle with the sun. Specifically, the cazimi is the moment when a planet is exactly conjoined the sun and is completely within sort of the section of the ecliptic that we associate with the sun's disk. So different traditions or different points in time will have different ideas about what exactly this cazimi period is. Older, more Hellenistic Greek astrology sources will tell us that a planet that is within the same degree of the zodiac as the sun is considered to be cazimi. I dislike this definition, and I prefer the later, more accurate medieval definition of cazimi, which is that a planet needs to be within 16 minutes of the sun. And the reason why I prefer this is because it agrees with the actual astronomical measurements of the sun. When we look up into the sky and we can see the sun, don't know for too long. But when that happens, the actual disk of the sun, the visible disk of the sun, takes up 32 minutes of arc of the zodiac. So the sun's actual disk that we see in the sky takes up a little bit more than half a degree in the zodiac. And so, of course, half of that is 16 minutes. You have the half that's in front of the middle and the half that's behind the middle, we'll say, adding up to a total of 32 minutes for the sun's complete disk. So that's why I prefer that definition, even though it is much more stringent. But it is the one that I prefer. And when a planet is cazimi, it's said to be within the heart of the sun and kind of fills up and takes in the power of the sun. So if you're kind of taking this within the context or the metaphor of a planetary life cycle, which is normally how the synodic cycle is described, if you think about the moon phase, for instance, as the moon, at the new moon, the moon separates from the sun and increases in light and grows like a human would, or like an animal or plant would that's newly formed, that's newly birthed. She grows as she waxes in light. She reaches her peak maturity at the full moon, and then after that she kind of wanes and declines into old age before she comes down and conjoins the sun again. And at this is on the one hand kind of seen as a death moment. This is the end of the cycle. That planet kind of symbolically dies. But that exact conjunction with the sun, that exact coming together with the sun in the same degree and minute of the zodiac, is like a reunion with the vital force, or the reunion with the deity or divinity of your choice, where the sun reinvigorates that planet, and the planet goes through like this rebirth process and comes out the other side, renewed in its cycle. So this cazimi moment and the rebirth process has specific meanings or utilization within, different symbolic interpretations of planets in certain circumstances, whether that be like a horary chart or a natal chart or an electional chart or whatever. But when we're talking about this moment specifically within like an astrological magical context, it's actually very difficult to utilize cazimis within like your standard kind of talismanic practices. because in order to do that, you kind of have to have them happen in very specific circumstances that are super, super difficult to get, because you would need, the moon to be configured with the cazimi like in a particular way. You would prefer the cazimi to be, happening in an angular house for that location, and better if you can get it to be during the planet that is being cazimied, the planet that's being kind of reborn during their day or hour. So kind of the deck is stacked against it because it's a specific moment in time. And depending on the planet that it is happening with, it will be kind of over fairly quickly. So for our Mercury Kasimi, here in the times for the moment of Kasimi, the conjunction with the Sun, are listed here in kind of my 3 standard locations. But the chart that I'm showing here is actually for Australia still. So making doing a standard talismanic practice is very difficult for Kasimi periods. So we typically don't worry about them very much. But one thing that I do think they're very useful for is kind of taking into consideration that rebirth, that cleansing process that the Kasimi represents, where a planet kind of leaves behind everything that it's picked up from its last cycle and comes back renewed, ready to pick up more stuff, we'll say, for this new cycle. The best thing that I found to do during this time period is to kind of symbolically clean or cleanse different either talismans that you already have, or like sacred spaces or materials that are dedicated to the planet that is undergoing the Kasimi process. So when we're talking about this Mercury Kasimi that's happening on the 19th and 20th, depending on your location, this is a really great time while this is happening, while the Kasimi is going on, to wash and cleanse and clean up any Mercury talismans you may have made, any Mercury altars you may have set up, or any sort of like Mercury materia. Go through it, make sure it's still good and fresh, for to use during this next cycle. And so when I try to do these, I always try to do them for like the moment of the Kasimi itself, like when it's actually happening, when that planet is exactly conjoined the Sun. That's kind of the moment in time that I shoot for, which is around like 1322, is around 122, around 130 for Australia. But like I said, the different times are listed here on the side. And that's what I try to do. I try to shoot for that specific moment, but kind of any time during the Kasimi period is fine, and it lasts for a while. I think it starts about like 2 hours before this and lasts about 2 hours after, but you don't really want to do the after period. You want to get like before or the exact period, if you're going to do any kind of cleansing that's involved with it. So I guess one quick note to talk about before I kind of open up this can of worms. Well, I guess we're going to do it anyway and then not really talk about it as much. But when it comes to Mercury and Venus, of course, they will conjoin the Sun twice in their cycles, but it's only when they are conjoined, the Sun moving direct, that we consider that like a cleansing or renewal of the cycle, not the retrograde motion. We don't consider that a cleansing or renewing, because it messes up different astronomical considerations and different terminology. But that's a whole other thing, a whole other debate worth having. Maybe not debate, conversation, I guess. But that's just kind of my viewpoint on it. So the other kind of big thing happening during this 2-week period is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that happens on December 21st. And this is really important within kind of like a broader context of mundane astrology and predictions, based off of, like events that are going to happen within the world, political things like that. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is something that occurs every 20 years. And typically the chart for that timing, especially when you kind of set it to capitals of different countries, helps to kind of predict things that are going to happen within that 20-year section of time. There's sort of like different chapters in world history, where certain, like political movements or maybe even environmental catastrophes and things like that can be kind of predicted, or some information can be gleaned from what that means from the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, kind of based generally on that 20-year period. So we have one coming up December 21st, 2020. We had one before, the previous one before this was in the year 2000. There was another one at the end of 1980. So while Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions are generally kind of important, this one that's happening in December 21st is actually more important than normal, in that it's going to be the first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in several hundred years to take place in air signs. For the past few hundred years, these Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions have occurred within Earth signs, aside from the exception of the one in 1980, which actually happened in Libra, which I think is probably more of like a prelude to things that are going to happen now, what's going to kind of the general theme of this next couple hundred years, that, those of us living today are not going to live to see. Really like the fruition of it all. So we'll have to kind of see what happens with that. But that's like a whole other thing that I'm not really prepared to get into here. What I did want to talk about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is that because it is such an important cycle and such a long-lived cycle, it could actually be kind of useful to look into from like a magical context where you have kind of this moment in the great kind of span or chasm of time that sets the tone for that chapter of time. Kind of luckily, I guess, the North American continent will actually be able to utilize this as sort of its first example of a Saturn in Aquarius talisman. It's a little imperfect, I think, but there's some really nice, just kind of like being able to tap into this moment in time and the importance and significance of it. May make up the difference for some of those unideal placements. So if you are interested in pursuing this, I think it's kind of a neat exercise in the whole thing. But the chart that we're looking at here is for a couple of moments after the exact conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, and it hits the right check boxes for a Saturn in Aquarius talisman that is then supported by the conjunction with Jupiter. So taking a look at it here really fast. We've got Saturn in Aquarius, angular on the midheaven. It's Saturn's hour, and the moon is applying the sextile to Saturn after she, as she moves into Aries, she'll exactly sextile Saturn there. So a lot of that basic framework that you want for a planetary talisman is actually there. Meanwhile, you have Venus as the ruler of the first house in Sagittarius. She's not afflicted by Mars or Saturn. And just it kind of looks fine. There are some things that are not that generally aren't super great, like the moon being conjoined the 12th house cusp. You could probably play with it a little bit depending on your location. To kind of pull the moon away from that house cusp, and Saturn is still hanging on to the midheaven, but now the moon is more fully into the 11th house here at at around 2:35. So this is something that's a little bit more, I guess, workable. But so you still kind of have that setup for your kind of typical Saturn planetary talisman. Unfortunately, this is not something that other locations will get to experience because they will have certain things set up to kind of block them, but we can kind of talk about that and explore that a little bit. So taking a look real quickly at the Western European version of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it happens with Jupiter and Saturn more close to the descendant, which is not really a house. It's an angular house, sure, but it's more inclined to like setting. We don't really want this house emphasized the way that we want, and the conjunction actually happens during a Mercury hour, so that's not really something that we could really utilize. It doesn't fit our check boxes that we want to have for a proper kind of Saturn planetary talisman. What we could do is, we can go back and look here to kind of see what's going on. To make it look a little bit more like the North American version, and we can get some of the things that we had before. Like we can get Jupiter and Saturn here on the midheaven like we want, and we can get Taurus on the ascendant with Venus in the 7th house. We can get the moon, in late Pisces. But our problem at this time is that the moon is applying this sextile to Jupiter instead of to Saturn, and you can argue like, that's true, but by the time the moon completes the aspect, Jupiter will have actually passed Saturn just slightly, and the moon, it looks like the moon is applying to Jupiter, but the moon will actually next perfect an aspect with Saturn. And it's like, yeah, you can argue that, but that's like literally frustration, which is an argument of a thing not working out, particularly within like horary astrology. So it's like, yeah, really this is what the moon is doing, but just by virtue of doing that thing of like having this relationship where she's looking like she's going to go to Jupiter, but then Jupiter passes Saturn and the moon hits Saturn is literally like an argument for a thing failing. And I would not prefer to have that baked into a talismanic election. So Western Europe, unfortunately, I think should pass on using that. So Australia's version actually looks a little bit nicer than some of the other ones to a certain extent, in that here, their Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, kind of the first time we can actually talk about it within like a useful application, is going to happen on the 22nd at around 7:19 a.m. And so you probably noticed that their conjunction, I guess it's kind of interesting that the three locations I normally look at, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happens on the angles, with, on the midheaven in North America, on the descendant in Western Europe, and now on the ascendant in Australia. So that's kind of cool. But I guess it's not the exact conjunction, but it's fine. And what we've got going on here is, of course, that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happening here on the ascendant now, with the first degree of Aquarius rising. And now we have the moon applying the sextile here, very, very close to Saturn on the ascendant. The only thing that we're missing really is it's not Saturn's hour or day. It's Mars's hour and Mars's day and the sun's hour in this chart. So you're missing that part of it. But if you wanted to, kind of eschew that and just go for it, I don't necessarily see why not. The only thing that you really have to worry about is the square of Mars. Make sure that you start, whatever you're going to do at a time where the ascendant is actually in Aquarius. So you have to be kind of quick, or else have it like the last couple of degrees of Capricorn, just so the ascendant isn't being squared Mars. But other than that, I mean, if you just want to forego the Saturn day hour consideration, that's fine. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as I always say. But just kind of keep in mind that you are missing that kind of important part, and make sure your ascendant's not squared by Mars, and you can also have a pretty good one. That lines up pretty nicely. So definitely worth looking into for these. If you want to kind of turn the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction into a Saturn planetary talisman, absolutely. North America and Australia have options that they can talk about for that. While Western Europe is kind of going to have to miss out some due to that Moon-Jupiter relationship, I guess. And another thing that I want to talk about, actually, that I forgot to mention when I probably should have earlier, is that for North America, December 17th is actually the date of the fixed star Antares' heliacal rise, which can be another important moment in an astrological magical context to make an Antares fixed star talisman. And I would recommend everybody taking a second to go and look at the video that I did talking about how to determine the date of heliacal rises for fixed stars for your location, because these are very location specific. So go take a look at that video, grab that program if you're at all interested in utilizing fixed star magic, and follow kind of my walkthrough to get it kind of set up and how to use it. And that'll tell you more exactly what your heliacal rise date is for the fixed star Antares. But for North America, for my location, around the 32 degree north mark, it's December 17th. But make sure to double check that, even if you are close to that degree of longitude, just to make sure. So with that in mind, we've got our first Lunar Mansion talisman on around December 22nd, the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, kind of the big headline thing happening on the 21st. And then the Mercury Kasimi, kind of the subheading there, that happens on the 19th or the 20th, depending on your location and your relationship to the international dateline. And that kind of covers kind of everything going on, a bit more big picture astronomically, and also a couple of things that we can do or utilize within a magical practice. So everybody take care, and I will see you all again on the Cancer full moon.